Hey guys, Joe Garth here, creator of Brushify.io. Welcome to another episode of Brushify Bootcamp. In this tutorial series, I'm going to be going over powerful Unreal Engine 4 features and workflows. Today we're going to be talking about roughness and roughness maps, and how you can use roughness to create more realism in your scenes. Roughness is an essential part of the physically based rendering pipeline. Physically based rendering is one of the new advances in rendering technology that helps things look a lot more realistic. So I'm going to go over the basics in this video of what you need to know to set up your roughness maps, import them into Unreal Engine, use those with the Brushify Landscape Automaterial shader, and also preview the roughness with the roughness buffer. So without further ado, let's jump right in. In order to follow this tutorial, you'll need the Brushify Environment Shaders pack from the Unreal Engine Marketplace. It contains all of the Brushify shaders and infrastructure that you see in these videos. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about roughness. This is where we got to last time, and what I'd basically done was imported two Megascans textures and got those set up with the Brushify Landscape Auto material. So now I can kind of sculpt around a bit, and you can see that the slope is working on these, and they're looking pretty good. But of course, there are a couple of missing features that would be really cool to get onto the terrain here, and one of them is roughness. So roughness is something that can add a lot of realism to a texture, and it's usually something that is only required in most cases for textures that are extremely wet or somehow slippery. If you've got a texture that's just something like this, like a completely dry cliff wall, or sort of dry ground, you don't really need a roughness map, because what you can do is you can basically use the default setup in Brushify, which will derive the roughness from the albedo. So let me explain that to you. If I go up to lit mode and I go to buffer visualization and I choose roughness, this will show you the roughness buffer. So this is basically what the renderer sees in terms of all the roughness maps. And as you can see, it's actually got some roughness information already. So where's that information coming from? So basically, if I pull up my content browser here, just hit content, and I go into materials and landscape, and I'm going to open up the m_landscape material. So I'm just going to explain to you where the roughness is coming from. So this is the sort of primary node for the landscape material. And you can also see that the roughness slot has actually been filled in. And that's done through this sort of color burn blending node. What that node is doing is it's actually taking the output of the base albedo, which has basically been passed through a bunch of different processes, to blend it with this sort of slope mask, to blend it with any directional blending for things like snow, and it takes the output of that albedo, and it basically pumps that through a power node. This means that this can now be used as an input for a roughness map. And then of course I give the user a bit of control with this little roughness scalar parameter over how rough they want the surface to be. So they have a bit of a way to kind of offset the brightness of the roughness map. And that result is what you see right here. So that's basically roughness derived entirely from the albedo map. So if I change the albedo map, these splotches here of white where it's not rough at all, those would change as well in combination with the albedo map. And for the case of most textures, especially one that's quite rough like this, it's almost white. That's all you actually need. That will give you a result like this where it just looks quite dry, and there is still a bit of roughness variation, so it's still sort of following the PBR rules, and you still get some slight variation on the surface. However, if you would want to, for instance, have some sort of puddles appearing on this texture, that is something that you would need a custom roughness map for. So what I'm going to do in this tutorial is I'm going to add a new roughness texture to this new landscape paint layer that we created in the previous tutorial, and I'm going to basically create some puddles. So let's see how that goes. So yeah, looking at this texture here, the one that we imported from Megascans, this one is already looking very good as a sort of rough texture. So I don't think that I need this one to be wet. However, it would be nice to be able to sort of paint down areas where we want to have puddles. Now there is already a material for this called the mud layer that already is packaged with Brushify. So we're going to start by painting down some areas where we want the mud to show up, and then later we're going to tweak that mud layer so that it shows up a little bit more wet. So I'm just going to go to the paint panel here, so landscape then paint, scroll down, go to the mud layer, and make sure you assign a layer info. You can create a new one, or you can just choose the one in the multi-biome/layer for infos folder. And once you have that, just click down, and you can start painting down areas that you think would look cool with a little bit more mud. And these are usually going to be sort of low-lying areas of the terrain, so you know, where you've got like a hole or where you've got sort of inset there. That's a really, you know, some places where mud basically gathers. It's usually like at the bottom of these slopes and things like that. So yeah, this is just, you know, up to you where you want to put this. More of an artistic thing, but yeah, it's just a, you know, interesting demonstration. And yeah, I'm just trying to vary the layers there a bit. So yeah, now we've got a few key areas that have got mud on it, that have got some mud going. Now one thing about this is, because we've got this very sort of head-on lighting, there aren't really any long shadows, and it's not really very easy to see surfaces that have, you know, any sort of specularity when you don't have a sort of light coming from the side. So I'm just going to go to my light source, and I'm just going to rotate the light a little bit so that we can have just a tiny bit of sun to sort of see the specularity. So now you can sort of see that specularity showing up on the surface here. And we're going to go in there and tweak that in a minute. But yeah, now you can nicely see that sort of shiny surface. And I'm just going to regenerate my skylight here. So if I just go on skylight, recapture, and see, I'm just going to tweak my skylight a little bit because it seems that it's not working. Just make sure the skylight is set to movable. That's important to make it work. And then yeah, just going to hit capture, and then yeah, now it will have a nice skylight effect. So we're already getting a little bit more of a realistic lighting in our world now that we have a skylight and a sort of directional light source. One thing I can also say that helps a little bit is sometimes if you tint your sun just a little bit orangish or a little bit yellow, that can help, especially just in your early stages of blocking, just to kind of have a slightly more realistic sun color. But yeah, usually best while you're doing these kind of texture things just to keep things quite neutral. But yeah, it's always nice to kind of see your materials in a beautifully lit scene or something like that. So yeah, I'm just running around in the game now, and you can see that you've got all these nice little nooks and crannies showing up on this kind of wet looking material here. And I'm going to show you then how this actually works. So if I go up to the lit panel and I go up to buffer visualization, and I'm going to go to roughness. So here you can actually see the roughness of the various paint layers, and you can see in the areas where I actually have roughness painted down that these areas are very dark. So the way that you can actually tweak the roughness maps on this layer, if I go to the content browser and I go to landscape materials, and these are all the materials in Brushify, and this is the mud layer we painted down now. So if you see here, there's MF mud, mud height, mud normals, and mud roughness. So I'm going to open up mud roughness, and inside this material function you have the pretty much usual anatomy of any other Brushify material. So yeah, if I go into the detail texture, so it's basically just the same as we set up in the previous tutorial on custom paint layers. You've got global, macro, and detail textures. Just going to zoom in a little bit more so you can read that. Yeah, global, macro, and detail textures. And this very, very bottom one here is the detail texture. So if we double click that and then double click on the texture, we've now opened up this this texture, and you can see that this is just a map with basically you know, some very interesting patterns that follow the albedo texture and the normals. So that this is a, you know, it's pretty much just a tiling texture, and yeah, I'm going to tweak this texture now. So I'm going to change the brightness on this texture. And as we increase the brightness, you can see that it changes the results that we get in the viewport in the actual roughness buffer. And if I go to the actual render view, you're going to be able to see this actually change in the render view. So you can see the different levels of roughness that can be achieved just by tweaking the sort of brightness and contrast of this texture. So here you've got a kind of like, it's not really that wet, it's somewhere in between super wet and, you know, quite rough, so it's somewhere in the middle. And then if I lower the brightness even further, I start to get these little highlights which make it look really, really wet, you know. And then if I lower it even further, you know, I almost don't have any roughness appearing at all, and that's because it's just not able to reflect anything, because it's just so smooth. So somewhere in between is usually best. And I'm also going to tweak the brightness curve a little bit. The brightness curve is essentially like contrast. So yeah, that's actually, I think, a good sort of middle ground. I think I'm going to go 2.5 there. And now I have, I think, a reasonably good sort of wet effect. So yeah, what if you want to actually switch these out for your own textures? Well, then it's just a case of, if we go up to the content browser, if you check out this in the MF Mud paint layer, so you've got the MF Roughness material function that we looked at before, and you can see this is where we sort of slot in all the various textures. And the way that this actually works is that if I go back to the content browser and I go to the MF Mud material function and open that up, you can see that within this material mud function is a reference right here to the mud underscore roughness. So it's exactly the same as the normals and the roughness, and later we'll talk about the height in the tessellation tutorial that's coming up. But yeah, basically this is just plugged in to the material attributes node here, and then it's outputted to the MF landscape layers material function, which we talked about in the previous tutorial. So mud roughness, if we double click on that, that just takes us right to here, the mud roughness. So, you know, this is really it. You can just copy and paste these, you know, these material functions, and just like the previous tutorial, create a custom paint layer yourself, and then just simply swap out the textures in each of these, and then you'll have your own custom roughness texture. What if we want to actually add a roughness map, a custom roughness map to our gravel as well? So since this is going to be a material paint layer that, you know, we've actually created from scratch from the last tutorial, I want to be able to show you guys how you can actually add a Megascan roughness map to that one as well. So yeah, you've seen how it's sort of, the system sort of works. Now let's implement that. So I'm going to go to the Brushify landscape materials folder. And if you remember from last time, we created a material function called mf underscore gravel. So I'm going to open that up. And yeah, if you remember, the mf gravel is basically, yeah, just a pretty much normal material function from Brushify. All of them look basically the same. This was where we referenced the albedo for all of our different Megascans textures. And right here you can see that we've got another embedded material function for the normal maps. Now right here we also want to have a new input, which is roughness. So right now it's completely empty. So we're going to need to create a new material function for gravel underscore roughness. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my materials folder. I'm going to right click the mud roughness and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to call this one instead mf underscore gravel roughness. So yeah, I've basically just stolen the mud material function and repurposed it for gravel now. And yeah, I'm just going to hit save on that and then open it up. So inside of here, you can see now we've got all of the mud roughness maps that are inputted. And I'm just going to take the detail map at the very bottom. So again, detail, macro, global. And I'm going to take this one and I'm going to change this out for our gravel Megascans texture. And use select as asset. And then, yeah, that's now the Megascans texture right there. So you can see though, this Megascans texture it's almost white. There's not that much going on in there. We're going to have to adjust that sort of later on to try and get a bit more detail out of that roughness map. But actually this is the correct PBR result for this material. This is often the case, you know, it's sort of like this. Sometimes some of the maps that you can get from sites like Megascans, they don't, you know, if it's a really rough material, there won't be much roughness information. So, you know, it will be almost white, which is why you can actually use, you can actually derive the roughness from the albedo in the shader. And actually then you can sometimes get slightly, you know, not as physically accurate, but, you know, more, you know, some slightly interesting results. You also have the added benefit of not having to have a new material function for the roughness, and also not actually using any of that new, any of that precious video memory and texture memory, you know, which doesn't have to, so that roughness map doesn't have to actually be stored. So wherever you can, it's better to derive textures in the shader because it's usually a little bit cheaper. So yeah, now I've got that and it's basically white. I'm just going to tweak it a little bit. I'm going to change the brightness, see what information we can get out of this thing. Yeah, so there's a little bit more information there. I'm going to change the contrast a little bit. And I'm just going to try to get some slight variations going in the texture itself. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, that'll work, I think. A little bit brighter, maybe 0.85. Okay, perfect. So save that. And now we've got our new material function. I'm going to go back to the MF gravel material function. I'm going to copy and paste this material function call. And instead of normals, I'm going to change that to our newly created roughness. And then I'm going to take the diffuse and I'm going to plug that into roughness right here, the diffuse output. That actually should, we should actually change that output to roughness. If you want to change it, you can. And then it, of course, gives you the correct output here, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a naming thing, you know, as long as the output leads to the roughness right here, everything will work. And then, yeah, I'm just going to hit save. Okay, perfect. So let's close down a bunch of these windows and let's compile. It's only going to take a second because we're only on a very small map. Okay, excellent. Okay, so now you can actually see on the surface that there is some sort of a sheen to it. You know, whereas before it was a very sort of blank. It was very blank in terms of there wasn't very much specularity showing on the surface. Now you can actually see a little bit. And you can see that the actual texture is slightly different here. So I'm going to tweak the texture once again for the roughness and see if we can get even more out of this. So yeah, if we start tweaking the roughness in the texture right now, we can see some of the results that can be achieved with that. So if I change it to 1 here, I'm just going to change back the brightness curve. And I'm just going to slowly start turning the brightness down until we can see it's starting to get some specularity there. So of course, you know, this one we don't really want to be a sort of wet material. So, you know, we can go crazy with it and make it really wet. But yeah, I think it doesn't really suit this kind of material. So maybe turning it up a little bit more gives it a very specular look. And just keep going up with the brightness until we get to a sort of comfortable middle ground where we want it to look slightly rough, but we want it to look rough. We want it to look maybe a little bit shiny, but we don't want it to have this sort of super polished wet look. Okay, and then I'm gonna go a bit crazier with the roughness because I think it's rock, so it doesn't really need to be that rough. And yeah, I'm sort of eyeballing it. You know, I'm tweaking the Megascan's texture and sort of eyeballing it. If we do change it back to the default settings, we're gonna get something like this. And actually, that looks pretty good too. So, you know, if you do want to tweak the stuff, you can just do it in the brightness and the brightness curve. If you're just happy with, you know, straight out of the box Megascan's roughness maps, by all means, they're really good. They're actually the physically correct settings, so you can be better off with those. So yeah, that just gives you the option to, you know, that's how you would add your own roughness textures to each paint layer and how you would use those. I hope that you're going to go out and try to use roughness maps with Brushify. You know, grab them from Megascans, grab them from, you know, Polygon, grab them from textures.com. Try out your own roughness maps, try out your own textures, and yeah, see if you can create some interesting effects with, you know, things like mud and you know, just polished and rough surfaces, you know, versus just the typical sort of, you know, rough textures. So yeah, I think it can be a really powerful thing if you're running along in the game and then you see a surface that's really got some nice, you know, specularity on it, and it's like very if you've got something that looks really wet in the game, it can give a real, you know, sense of realism. There's a demo I played a very long time ago, which was Half-Life 2 Lost Coast, and I think it was one of the first times I saw, you know, some really well done specularity on texture work that was, you know, it just looked mind-blowing back in the day. And, you know, those are the kind of little details that can really help your game to really shine and to look more realistic. So yeah, roughness, definitely something to keep an eye on. If in doubt, remember to check your buffer visualization and go to roughness, and then you can view what is happening under the hood, and you can see you know, what areas are being rendered rough and what areas are being rendered polished, you know, wet, and that will give you a really good indication of what's actually happening in the engine. And yeah, so hopefully you guys are going to try something, try experimenting on your own. And in addition to roughness on the landscape, you can also tweak roughness on objects. So yeah, let's quickly preview that now. So if you go to any Brushify mesh, I'm going to just drag and drop one of the cliff meshes down. Yeah, so we have these sort of rock slabs. Yeah, this will do. So this is a rock slab, you know, it's just one of the generic rocks that you get with Brushify. And I'm just going to jam that into the side of the cliff here. Let's see if I can just turn off my snapping. And yeah, let's just jam that into the side of this cliff, just so it looks nice. And you'll notice that it does have some roughness on it by default. But, you know, imagine that I would want to tweak this roughness. How would I go about doing that? So yeah, if we go to, again, the rough buffer visualization mode, you can see that everywhere is slightly, you know, it's pretty much all rough. There are some parts that are a bit more smooth and polished. But say I want to make it rougher, say I want to make it smoother, how do I do that? So click on the rock and go to the material instance. I'm just going to double click that. And this will bring us to the Brushify Near Mesh master material. And inside of this master material, we've got a few options for roughness. I'm going to go to the buffer visualization again. So you can see we've got invert roughness, and that'll actually invert the... so all of this right here is derived from albedo. So these aren't roughness maps or anything, this is just derived from the albedo, but what I've tried to do is give you a few options for tweaking the look. So firstly, you've got the invert roughness, and you can basically enable and disable that. And this is really cool because it means that, you know, if you do have an albedo where there are certain things that you think, you know, should be rough or shouldn't be rough, you've got a bit of an option there to tweak it. So in this case, it's like, what if I want the parts that are on the edges to have, to be really wet, but then I want the parts in between to be rough, or vice versa. It makes actually more sense this way around, because you would want the sort of, some parts of it that where it hasn't quite dried yet, the wetness is still lingering in the sort of recesses. So, and then the next thing you've got to be able to tweak the roughness is the roughness contrast setting, which just allows you to, of course, tweak the contrast of that roughness map. You can do that in real time just by tweaking the slider. And then you've got brightness as well. So those all give you a few options, I think. And then there's also overall specularity. So if you just don't want any specularity at all on an object, you can just kill it. And then you'll just have a completely blank specularity there. But that usually doesn't look that realistic. It won't match the rest of the scene, especially if you've got something like this. A few more options. Like, what is interesting is, of course, you can also, I'll talk about this in another tutorial when I go over this material in depth. But you can also just quickly tint this material. So if I do want to just match the look of this ground here, this sort of mud ground, I can do that. So yeah, that's now a little bit more matching to the ground. And if you really want to match it perfectly, you can then go in and tweak the base color pass to get it really, really close. So yeah, base color pass, that's another really useful one. If you go into buffer visualization, then base color, you can then visualize how the base color looks. That's the albedo. And then, yeah, now you can see how just how much better that's actually matching just by a little albedo tint tweak. Let's undo it now and just check how it looked before. So all my tweaks. So you can see like how it looked before. It just looks way, way worse when you've got a rock that's kind of just sticking out of the scene like a sore thumb, versus when I, actually bother to kind of merge it. Anyway, so yeah, I think that basically covers roughness. You can import, so we've gone over how you import your own textures, how you add those textures to a paint layer, how you can use the existing mud paint layer as a sort of example and as a sort of something that you can just duplicate those material functions and sort of reverse engineer that material layer yourself. We've done a bit of painting here on the terrain to paint various areas a little bit more muddy and give that nice sort of wet look. And we've also gone over how you can use the near mesh the near mesh material to tweak the roughness settings on your objects like this, and also how you can use the albedo tint to sort of match the base color of your assets. So I love doing that. So it's really, really great to be able to see just like how quickly you can make something that didn't really fit a scene before just instantly start to fit a scene. And yeah, it's a very, very powerful tool, very, very powerful shader set right here, and one that allows you to do a lot. So I'm just gonna end up by sort of placing a few more of these rocks down because I think they look quite cool. And then yeah, let's maybe flip that one around. These rocks are very useful because you can just change how they are laid out. And yeah, so if you guys found this tutorial useful, be sure to click that like button and subscribe to my channel, and I'll have more Brushify Bootcamp videos coming shortly. So yeah, see you later guys. Cheers.